The banner on the mast is a cross, red cloth, white cross, snapping in a wind that smells like salt and tar. Ahead of the ship, over the water, another city rises, towers, domes, a wall so long it disappears into haze at both ends. And on those walls, more crosses, Christian crosses on a Christian city. Watching a fleet of men who swear they serve the same God sail straight toward them. This is the spring of the year 1204. The men on that ship set out 2 years earlier with one promise. Take back Jerusalem, free the holy city from the armies that hold it. That was the vow. That was the entire reason 40,000 men were supposed to gather, cross the sea, and die for something larger than themselves if it came to that. It did not go that way. By the time this fleet reaches Constantinople, it has already attacked one Christian city. It has already been excommunicated by its own pope. And in a matter of days, it will do something no army in the history of the Crusades had done before. Turn its full weight against the largest, richest, most sacred Christian capital on earth. Not raid it, not threaten it, burn it for 3 days straight, and leave it broken for the rest of its existence. Historians still argue about exactly when the plan changed. But the ending is not in dispute. The men who sailed under that cross-marked banner did not fail to reach Jerusalem. They simply stopped trying because somewhere along the way, a debt got too large to walk away from. To understand how that happens, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the walls of Constantinople, to a shipyard in Venice and a bill nobody could pay. Pope Innocent III called for this crusade in the year 1201. The plan was simple on paper: sail from Venice, land in Egypt, strike at the heart of Muslim power in the region, and use that as the road back into Jerusalem. Simple plans need 2 things to survive contact with reality: enough men and enough money. This one had neither. Venice agreed to build the fleet. Not a small favor, an enormous one. Ships large enough to carry over 30,000 soldiers and their horses, built and crewed at Venice's expense on the promise of payment once the army assembled. The Venetians shut down other trade to make room for the order. Then the army showed up, or rather it didn't. Barely a third of the expected force arrived at Venice in the summer of 1202. The math broke immediately. A fleet built for 30,000 men, paid for by a promise from 30,000 men, now had roughly 10,000 men standing on the dock, with nowhere near enough silver between them to cover what was owed. The debt didn't just sit there. It grew. Every week the fleet stayed idle. Every week the Crusaders camped on an island in the lagoon, eating through what little money they had left. Venice had already spent the resources. Venice expected to be paid, and Venice's ruler, a man named Enrico Dandolo, was not going to let an unpaid war fleet sink the city's finances. Dandolo was somewhere around 90 years old, blind by most accounts from an old injury, and completely undiminished as a negotiator. He offered the stranded Crusaders a way out. Help Venice retake the port city of Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast that had recently broken away from Venetian control, and the debt could wait. Zara was not an enemy city. It did not belong to any Muslim power. It was Catholic, ruled by a Catholic king, and its people hung crosses from their walls when the Crusader fleet arrived, hoping that would be enough to stop a holy army from attacking. It was not enough. The city fell in November of 1202, sacked by men who had taken a vow to fight for Christendom. Against a city that belonged to Christendom, Pope Innocent's response was immediate. Excommunication for the entire army, a formal declaration that these men, marching under his own crusade, were now outside the grace of the Church they claimed to be defending. It is worth sitting with that for a second. Before Constantinople, before any of what follows, the Fourth Crusade had already broken its own purpose once, and the men leading it decided to keep going anyway. That decision to keep going rather than turn back is the hinge this entire story swings on. And it's about to happen again on a much larger scale because of one exiled prince with an offer nobody in that freezing indebted camp could refuse. His name was Alexius Angelos. His father, Isaac II, had once ruled Constantinople before being deposed, blinded, and thrown in prison by his own brother. Alexius escaped to the west, and now, hearing that a Crusader army sat stranded near Zara with a debt they couldn't pay, he saw an opportunity. He offered them everything: 200,000 silver marks, 10,000 soldiers to help finish the journey to Jerusalem, and the one promise that mattered most to Rome: the reunion of the Orthodox Church with the Catholic Church, healing a split a century and a half old. All he needed in return was a fleet willing to sail to Constantinople and put him on the throne. So follow the thread so far. A crusade meant for Jerusalem gets diverted to a debt in Venice. That debt gets diverted into an attack on a Christian city, and now that same stranded army is being offered a fortune to sail even further off course toward the one city in the world too large, too rich, and too well defended for anyone to imagine actually conquering it. Stay with me, because the worst decisions in this story haven't even been made yet. And if this kind of history keeps your attention, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of it coming. The Crusader fleet reached Constantinople in the summer of 1203. What they saw stopped them cold. Robert of Clary, a knight riding with the army, wrote that none of them had believed a city so large could exist anywhere on earth. Walls stretching for miles, towers beyond counting. More people inside those walls than most of the Crusaders had seen in their entire lives combined. This wasn't a raid on some border town. This was the capital of an empire that had stood for 8 centuries. The attack that followed was almost anticlimactic. Alexius's uncle, the man who'd seized the throne, fled the city rather than fight. The Crusaders reinstalled Isaac II, blind, aged, barely functional as a ruler, and crowned his son alongside him as Alexius IV. For a moment, the plan had worked exactly as promised. Then the money didn't come. 200,000 silver marks is not a number a treasury produces by decree. Alexius IV raised taxes. He melted down church icons for their silver, an act that horrified his own people far more than it impressed the Crusaders waiting outside the walls for payment. And even after stripping the city for coin, he still couldn't cover what he'd promised. The betrayal didn't start with foreign knights breaking down a gate. It started with a Byzantine prince spending his own capital's wealth and goodwill trying to buy an army he'd invited in himself. The people of Constantinople watched their emperor strip their churches to pay off a foreign fleet camped outside their walls. And they turned on him. Winter came, riots spread, and in January of 1204, a Byzantine noble named Alexius Doukas, remembered by the nickname Mortzuflos, moved against the increasingly hated young emperor. Alexius IV was arrested and strangled in his cell. Isaac, his blind father, died soon after. The record is unclear whether from illness or from the same hand. Mortzuflos took the throne and immediately made his position clear to the Crusaders camped outside the city. There would be no more payment and no more welcome. Put yourself in that camp for a moment. Months of waiting, a debt from Venice still unpaid, a second debt now permanently unpaid because the man who owed it was dead, winter supplies running low, and beyond the walls, the richest city on earth, close enough to see, impossible to reach by any means except the one nobody wanted to say out loud. By March of 1204, the leaders of the Crusade signed a new agreement. If the city fell, they would divide its wealth among themselves, and Venice would take its long overdue payment directly from the spoils. There was no Jerusalem in this contract, just a plan to take by force what a broken promise had failed to deliver by negotiation. On the 12th of April, 1204, the Venetian fleet moved into position along the Golden Horn. Constantinople's land walls, the ones facing Europe, triple-layered, studded with towers, unbroken for 8 centuries, were nearly impossible to breach. Everyone knew that. So the fleet didn't go near them. They went for the sea walls instead. Lower, thinner, built for a threat that had never seriously come from the water. Venetian ships carried flying bridges, wooden platforms rigged to the mastheads, built to swing out and drop straight onto the battlements. One by one, under arrow fire, under stones thrown from the walls above, those bridges came down onto the ramparts near the Blachernae Palace. Knights crossed them on hands and knees at first, then on foot, then running. By afternoon, a handful of towers had fallen. By evening, the defenders were fleeing rather than dying to hold a wall that had already been breached in a dozen places. The cross on the mast that opened this story, the one sailing toward a Christian city, past Christian banners on Christian walls, belonged to men who had just proven those banners meant nothing to them anymore. Mourtzouphlos fled the city overnight. There was no one left to negotiate surrender terms, and no need to. What followed lasted 3 days. Nicetas Choniates, a Byzantine official who lived through it, described soldiers stripping churches bare, not just of gold and silver, but of anything that could be carried, melted or sold. The great altar of Hagia Sophia, the largest church in Christendom, was broken apart for its silver. Sacred vessels became drinking cups. According to Choniates' account, a woman was seated on the patriarch's own throne inside Hagia Sophia, while soldiers celebrated around her. The bronze horses that had stood in the hippodrome for centuries were pulled down, crated and shipped back to Venice, where they still stand today over the doors of St. Mark's Basilica. This is not a story about greedy soldiers losing control for 3 days. This is not a story about one bad doge, one broken promise, or one dead prince. This is a story about a debt that grew large enough to make an army forget. One decision at a time exactly who it had sworn to protect. Think about how organizations behave when they've sunk too much into a plan to admit it failed. The deeper you're in, the harder it becomes to walk away, even when walking away was always the right answer. The Fourth Crusade didn't set out to destroy Constantinople. It backed into that decision one unpaid debt at a time, until burning the city looked less like a betrayal and more like the only way left to get paid. Jerusalem was never retaken. Not by this crusade, not by the men who set out 2 years earlier swearing they'd free it or die trying. Instead, they took something else entirely, the capital of the largest Christian empire on earth, and they left it burning. 3 things are worth carrying out of this. The Fourth Crusade never came close to its own stated goal. It ended over 1,000 miles from Jerusalem, having fought exactly one enemy the whole way, a Christian city, twice. A cause doesn't have to be abandoned all at once to be lost. It gets traded away in pieces, a debt here, a detour there, a promise nobody can actually keep, until the people making the decisions can't remember the last moment they were still fighting for what they started with. And the wound never closed. Byzantium never recovered the wealth, the population, or the defenses it lost in those 3 days. When Constantinople finally fell for good to Ottoman cannons in 1453, it fell as a shell of the city it had been 250 years earlier, a city the Crusaders had already broken, long before anyone else finished the job. So here's the question worth sitting with. Of everyone in this story, the Crusaders who broke their vow, the Venetians who called in their debt, or the Byzantine court that tore itself apart from the inside, who do you think bears the most responsibility for what happened in 1204? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes the people who destroy what you love aren't the ones who hate you. They're the ones who ran out of any other way to get what they were owed.